There is a place in China where the ground sits higher than most planes are allowed to cruise. The air up there is so thin that walking too fast can knock you flat. The cold is so brutal, it turns regular concrete into powder. The wind comes without warning. The sky feels closer than it should. And right in the middle of all of that, in a place where every rule of aviation works against you, China built a fully functioning commercial airport. Not a dirt strip, not a military base, a real airport, a gleaming terminal, a runway nearly 3 miles long, and flights carrying hundreds of passengers every single week. The airport sits 14,472 feet above sea level. That is higher than most mountain peaks in Europe, higher than where many private jets fly. So high that the human body starts breaking down just from being there. So high that the engines of a commercial aircraft lose a significant chunk of their power before the wheels even leave the ground, and yet it works every single day. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how they pulled it off. And some of what they did is genuinely hard to believe. But to understand why this airport exists at all, you first need to understand the people it was built for. Because this was never really a story about engineering. It was a story about 400,000 people who were completely cut off from the rest of the world, and a decision that refused to accept that. In the western part of Sichuan province in China, there is a region called Garzei Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture. The name sounds remote. The reality is even more extreme. The entire area is wrapped on all sides by the Hengduan Mountains. These are not gentle rolling hills. These are towering, jagged, violent peaks that shoot straight into the sky and stretch for hundreds of miles in every direction. For the people living inside this region, those mountains were not scenery. They were a wall. Getting in or out meant driving on narrow roads carved directly into the sides of cliffs. Roads so thin that 2 cars could barely pass each other. Roads where one wrong turn meant falling hundreds of feet into a river valley below. On the other side of those mountains sat Chengdu, the nearest major city. The drive takes 2 full days, not 2 hours, 2 days. And that is if the weather stays clear. When it rains or snows, landslides block the roads entirely. People have been stranded for weeks. Think about what that means in real life. If you needed surgery, you were 2 days away from a proper hospital. If you wanted a better job, you had to survive a 2-day mountain drive just to reach an interview. If your business needed supplies from the outside world, every single delivery was a logistical nightmare. Education, healthcare, economic opportunity, all of it was sitting just on the other side of those mountains, completely out of reach. Roads were too dangerous and took too long to build. A proper highway through the Hengduan Mountains would have required decades of blasting and drilling that the terrain simply would not allow. Trains faced the same problem. A rail line through those mountains was not just expensive, it was physically nearly impossible to build straight enough to be useful. One idea kept coming back. One option that sounded crazy at first, but made more sense the longer anyone thought about it. If you cannot get through the mountains, fly over them. Building an airport in the Hengduan Mountains was not a new idea. Engineers had floated it before, but every time it came up, the same brutal problems came up with it. There were almost no flat patches of land large enough for a runway. The few spots that existed sat at extreme altitudes, and at those altitudes, the normal rules of flying simply did not apply. But here is the thing about Garzei. The choice was never between a mountain airport and a convenient lowland airport. The choice was between a mountain airport and nothing was no longer acceptable. So engineers and officials made a decision that took real courage. They picked the best available site, acknowledged it was going to be the hardest airport ever built, and decided to figure it out anyway. The site they chose was in Daocheng County. It's at 4,411 meters above sea level, 14,472 feet. To put that in perspective, the highest peak in the continental United States is Mount Whitney at 4,505 feet. This airport sits at nearly the same height as the tallest mountain most Americans will ever look at from a distance and think, no way, anyone is going up there. When it opened in September 2013, Daocheng Yading Airport officially became the highest civilian airport on the planet. It took the record from another Chinese airport and has held it ever since. But the record was never the point. The point was connecting 400 people to the rest of China. And to do that, the engineers had to solve problems that no one had ever had to solve before. Here is where the science gets genuinely wild. At sea level, the air around you is thick with molecules. You breathe them in, your body processes them, everything works the way it is supposed to. But as you go higher, those molecules spread out. By the time you reach the height of Daocheng Yading Airport, the air is 40% thinner than at sea level. 40%. That is not a rounding error. That is almost half the air simply gone. For humans, that means less oxygen with every breath. Your brain slows down, your muscles tire faster. Simple tasks feel exhausting. Your head starts pounding. This is altitude sickness, and it hits hard and fast at this elevation. But for planes, the problem goes even deeper than that. A plane does not just breathe air, it needs air to fly. Here is how flight actually works. A plane's wings are shaped so that air moving over them creates an upward force called lift. The faster the plane moves and the more air surrounds it, the more lift those wings generate. That lift is what gets a 350-pound machine off the ground and keeps it there. At sea level, there is plenty of air to work with. But at 14,000 feet, with 40% of that air missing, the wings generate far less lift. The engines lose power too because they burn fuel by mixing it with air, and with less air available, they cannot work nearly as hard. The result is that a plane needs to be moving significantly faster down the runway before it has enough lift to leave the ground, and faster means longer. A plane that normally needs around 0 feet of runway to take off at sea level might need close to double that at extreme altitude. The runway at Daocheng Yading Airport stretches 13,800 feet. That is longer than almost any commercial runway anywhere on Earth. It had to be that long just to make takeoff physically possible. The same problem applies in reverse on landing. At sea level, thick air naturally slows a plane down once it touches the ground. Air resistance pushes back hard, but at this altitude, that resistance is dramatically reduced. A plane landing here arrives faster and stops slower. Without a runway long enough to absorb all of that energy, it would roll straight off the end and into the mountain. So the engineers had a single non-negotiable requirement before anything else could begin. Nearly 3 miles of perfect runway in the middle of the Hengduan Mountains at 14,000 feet above sea level. Construction officially began in April 2011, and before a single foundation was poured, the team faced a problem that most construction projects never have to think about at all. How do you get your equipment up there? The first step was building access roads, not regular roads, heavy-duty roads capable of carrying the weight of cranes, cement mixers, steel beams, and everything a project of this scale requires. Those roads had to wind through the same brutal mountain terrain that made the whole project necessary in the first place. Just building the access routes was itself a serious construction challenge that took months. Then the machinery arrived, and it immediately started failing. At sea level, diesel engines work exactly the way they are designed to. But at 14,000 feet with 40% less oxygen in the air, engines choke. They lose power, they overheat in unexpected ways. The standard construction equipment that works perfectly at lower altitudes was essentially useless up there. The team had to source specialized high-altitude versions of nearly every machine on site. Equipment specifically designed and modified to function in low-oxygen environments. The ground itself was the next problem. The soil on the plateau was not regular dirt, it was permafrost, ground that stays frozen year-round, not just in winter. Drilling into it, leveling it, and preparing it for construction required a completely different approach than anything most crews had ever worked with. And then there was the concrete. Concrete is the backbone of any runway. It needs to be poured, spread, and allowed to cure properly. The curing process involves water inside the mixture slowly evaporating as it hardens. But near-freezing temperatures completely disrupt that process. The water does not evaporate the way it should. Instead, it freezes inside the concrete and then thaws, leaving behind tiny internal air pockets that hollow out the structure from within. A runway full of those weak spots would crack and crumble under the weight of commercial aircraft within months. The solution was a custom concrete formula. Engineers added antifreeze compounds and other chemical agents directly into the mixture to prevent these water from freezing during curing. This allowed the concrete to set properly, even in near-zero temperatures, and come out with the structural strength that a 13,800-foot commercial runway demands. Every foot of that runway had to be perfect. There was no margin for weak sections or inconsistencies. Because at this airport, a flaw in the runway is not a maintenance issue. It is a life or death issue. And the workers doing all of this were suffering in the same thin air that was causing every other problem on the project. Altitude sickness was constant. Headaches, dizziness, shortness of breath, exhaustion after minimal effort. The team managed this by rotating workers frequently so no one was overexposed for too long. Anyone showing serious symptoms was pulled off site and given oxygen immediately. Workers in the most exposed positions carried personal oxygen canisters on the job every single day. 2 years of work under those conditions produced something remarkable. But the runway was only half the story. While one team was fighting the mountains to build the runway, another team was designing a terminal with a requirement unlike anything in standard airport architecture. The building had to keep people from getting sick. At 14,000 feet, every single person who steps off a plane is immediately exposed to thin air their body is not adapted to. Altitude sickness can set in within minutes for some passengers. So the terminal was not just designed to process travelers. It was designed to protect them. The building was shaped with a curved, raised form that gave it a futuristic appearance. But the shape was not purely aesthetic. The curved structure helped with both stability in extreme wind and heat retention in brutal cold. Large windows wrapped around the entire building, but they were UV filtering glass. They allowed natural light to warm the interior while blocking the intense ultraviolet radiation that hits far harder at high altitude than at sea level. The entire layout was planned around one single goal: minimize how much walking passengers have to do. At sea level, walking through a long airport terminal is mildly annoying. At 14,000 feet, it can trigger a full altitude sickness episode. So everything inside the terminal was placed as close together as physically possible. Short distances between the entrance, the gates, and the services. The air pressure inside the terminal is also artificially managed. A special pressurization system keeps oxygen levels higher inside the building than outside. Breathing inside the terminal is noticeably easier than stepping out the front door. For first-time arrivals, that pressurized air is their first line of defense against the altitude. For those who still get hit, oxygen stations are positioned throughout the building. Passengers can sit down, put on a mask, and breathe concentrated oxygen until they feel stable. Emergency medical services remain on standby for more serious cases at all times. Even the sitch inside was redesigned from the ground up. One of the early symptoms of low oxygen is confusion. People lose their sense of direction without realizing it. So the signs here are unusually large, brightly colored, and placed far more frequently than at any standard airport. Even a disoriented traveler can figure out where they are going. The giant windows serve a psychological purpose too. When your brain is receiving less oxygen than it is used to, a clear view of the outside world helps you stay oriented and calm. The total project cost $255 million, and when it was done, it was not just an airport, it was a life support system with departure gates attached. But even a perfectly built airport at 14,000 feet cannot run on standard aviation rules. When Daocheng Yading opened in September 2013, an entirely new set of operating regulations had to be written specifically for it, because none of the existing rules of commercial aviation were ever designed with a place like this in mind. The first major rule was about timing. Flights at Daocheng Yading only operate in the morning. By afternoon, the mountain weather becomes genuinely unpredictable. Wind speeds climb fast. Clouds roll in without warning. Visibility drops in minutes. The chaotic afternoon conditions make flying in and out of this airport dangerous in ways that standard weather management cannot reliably handle. So the airport simply does not allow afternoon flights. All traffic is scheduled for the calmer morning hours. A dedicated weather monitoring system was built specifically for the airport using sensors designed to track the unusual wind and cloud patterns of high-altitude mountain terrain. Air traffic controllers use this data in real time to make go or no-go decisions. The system is more advanced than what most airports anywhere in the world currently operate, because the consequences of a wrong call here are far more severe. The second major rule was about who is allowed to fly here at all. Not every pilot is cleared for Daocheng Yading. Only experienced pilots who have completed specific high-altitude certification are permitted on this route. The certification involves specialized training in how planes behave differently at extreme altitude and how to navigate the mountain terrain surrounding the airport on approach and departure. During takeoff and landing, the most demanding moments of any flight, pilots here are required to wear oxygen masks. At sea level, pilots breathe cabin air without any issue. But the combined workload of operating at 14,000 feet, the thin air leaking into the cockpit during boarding and taxiing, and the heightened demands on concentration during critical phases can begin, affecting a pilot's brain function before they even notice it happening. The masks eliminate that risk during the moments when clear thinking matters most. Planes flying into Daocheng Yading also carry fewer passengers and less cargo than their standard capacity. Less total weight means the aircraft can generate enough lift to clear the runway even with the reduced air density. A fully loaded wide-body jet simply could not get airborne under these conditions. Weight limits are strictly enforced on every single flight. Every one of these rules exists for the same reason. The margin for error here is genuinely small. The mountains surrounding the airport leave no room for a missed approach. If a landing goes wrong, there is no second chance to circle around and try again. The terrain and the thin air make a go-around extremely difficult under the best conditions. And if something goes wrong after touchdown, help takes a very long time to arrive. Despite all of that, the airport has operated successfully for over a decade. The safety protocols have held. The flights keep running, and the lives of 400,000 people changed permanently because of it. Before 2013, getting from Daocheng County to Chengdu meant 2 full days of driving cliff-edge mountain roads with constant risk of landslides and getting stranded. For most residents, a trip to the city was something you planned for weeks and undertook only when absolutely necessary. After the airport opened, that same journey became a 1-hour flight. Think about what that shift actually means. A patient needing specialized surgery could reach a hospital in an hour instead of 2 days. A student could study in the city and come home for weekends. A local business owner could meet suppliers in Chengdu and be back for dinner. The mountain wall that had isolated this community for generations was suddenly not a barrier anymore. Tourism followed quickly. The Garzei region contains some of the most stunning landscapes in all of China. The Yading Nature Reserve, with its turquoise lakes and snow-capped peaks, had been considered one of China's best-kept secrets, largely because it was so difficult to reach. Once the airport opened, visitors began arriving in numbers the region had never seen. New guest houses opened, restaurants expanded, tour companies appeared. An economy that had been stagnating for decades started growing. But growth always comes with complications. Experts have raised serious concerns about whether the natural environment can handle the sudden jump in human activity. The ecosystem at this altitude is fragile. The same isolation that kept people out for so long also kept the land pristine. More visitors means more waste, more pressure on wildlife, more development creeping into untouched terrain. The airport that saved an economy could also threaten the nature that makes the region worth visiting in the first place. That tension is real, and it is not resolved. That is the complicated legacy of Daocheng Yading Airport. It is a $255 million proof that human ingenuity can solve problems that look completely unsolvable. It is evidence that engineering and stubbornness together can punch through the toughest barriers nature puts up. And at the same time, it is a reminder that solving one problem almost always opens the door to a new set of questions. The planes fly, the people are connected, the mountains are still there, just as enormous as they have always been. But now, for the first time, they are not a wall. So here is the question we're thinking about. An airport like this transforms the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, but it also opens a fragile and pristine part of the world to pressures it was never built to handle. Was it worth it? And who gets to decide that? Drop your honest answer in the comments. If this video was worth your time, hit like and subscribe. Because the stories of what humans build when they refuse to accept impossible, we cover those every single week.